Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Eischen, Executive Director of Rochester Area Builders, and welcome to our Land Development Manual Rewrite Update webinar. If you have questions, you can type them into the questions or enter them in the chat. Once I disappear, that's what I will be doing, is monitoring questions and submit them anytime, and we will get those answered. With that, I will turn it over to Cindy Steinhauser, the Community Services Development Director. Did I say that right?
Sure did. Community Development Director. Thanks, John.
Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I see we have like 150 attendees on, and that's really fantastic. I'm not going to take much time because there's a lot of content here, and we want to be sure to leave room for you to answer questions. But I really just wanted to start today by saying thank you. Thank you for your support in not only helping to make this a real issue that we tackled right after we got the department up and running, but I want to extend a special thanks to John and his team for being very actively engaged with us on this journey, not only kind of defining what it is we need to try and do here to make our regulatory process relevant with the 21st century, but also the real spirit of collaboration and the candid conversations that we're able to have with John, his team, and connecting us to all of you. I just want to also give some great shout out to the people on our city team, Ryan Yetzer to begin with, who's been shepherding this process in a really amazing way. He's been a real asset to bring to our team, and we were so glad personally we were able to recruit him away. And then for Don and Austin, who have been on this journey in Rochester longer than I've been here. So with that, again, just appreciate your presence here and hopefully continued presence over the next 12 to 18 months as we have more big milestones to tackle in this new code process that we're trying to work our way through. So with that, I'll shut up and turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Cindy. Welcome, everybody. I'll go ahead and kick this off with a slide here, and then I'll turn it over to our consultants. So just real quick, I wanted to set the table for today's, I guess, presentation. Our purpose of this presentation isn't to go through every little detail that was included in Installment 1. Installment 1 is a large document, admittedly, which is why we tried to give everybody as much time as possible before this meeting, but we wanted to keep the process moving along at the same time. So our intent isn't to go over every detail that's in the Installment 1. Our intent is to hit the details that we think folks would be most interested in. And then also our intent is to try to spark your interest to go through and look at the document. You really have to get into the document, review it in order to fully grasp what we're trying to do here. The other thing I'm going to make a quick plug for, if you can't get your question answered today, we have set up what we're calling a UDC Q&A cafe times. They're listed here. The Zoom link is also listed on this slide. These links are listed on our website, the community development website under Unified Development Code project. I'll just be sitting in a meeting room. Come and go as you please. Come get your questions answered. We can have a conversation. You can hang around and hear what others have to ask. If you just have one quick question, this might be a good way to get it answered. So with that, I will turn it over to our consultant and Don Elliott. Don, take it away.
All right, thank you. Let's use your time wisely. Austin, can you advance to the next slide? So we're going to, we have broken this drafting process up into modules. I know there may be some frustration out there, as in, well, I don't know how to read this part without reading all of it. Well, that's a fair comment, but trust us, trying to draft it all at once and dropping it in your lap would not reduce your level of frustration, and it would certainly not reduce the public's level of frustration. So whenever we do a large city complex rewrite like this, we divide it into installments. Today is districts and uses. The next will be development standards, things like parking and landscaping and lighting, design, and finally is procedures. And it basically allows people to focus, you and the public and other stakeholders to focus on a particular topic, and it builds the code up from the bottom. It's kind of funny to talk about parking before you've decided whether this is one use or two different uses or three different uses. We don't know. Parking is not supposed to be driving the boat. The uses and the districts and what can I do and how big can it be, that's driving the boat. The rest of it builds on that. And so we try to build the code from the bottom up. Let's go to the next slide. We know there's a delay in this process, so bear with us while we wait for things to advance. All right, so why are we doing this? Just to remind it, we've been in touch with Rochester area builders, not just in this project, but the prior one on TODs. Once again, the current process is very time consuming and unpredictable. It is fairly out of date in terms of best practices around the country. Obviously, Rochester doesn't need to follow somebody else's best practices, but you ought to know how other large complex cities are handling these issues. In many cases, it is in a significantly different way than you do. Incentive and restricted development have become the norm for many types of development. They ought to be exceptions. Code ought to be written so that most of the things, and in your case, a lot of mixed use combinations that are routine around the country, do not require you to go through these hoops. That has been a topic since the first day we showed up in 2018, where it's kind of this, you know, you got a 1,300-page code and then everybody reads 5 pages of it because they go through restricted development to avoid having to read the other 1,295 pages. And so that ought to be sorted out. It's very time consuming. Some things like special districts are one-offs that are very hard to administer. It'd be nice to get to a simpler way. Other districts, like the overlay zones for downtown parking, are just more complicated. There are lots of ways of having different parking standards for downtown without an overlay, which then, trust me, tends to trip over other overlays in the downtown area. So, and finally, so many things in Plan to Succeed that just are not reflected in the current code. That was the impetus behind the whole thing. A, it's complex, it's time consuming, somewhat unpredictable, and it doesn't seem to reflect the new goal. Where are we in the process? You can see the green bars illustrate the modules that we're doing. Restricted into districts and uses is first. Development standards will come second. Development standards, as I said earlier, parking, landscaping, dimensions. And then after you've decided what the basic rules and incentives are in Rochester and the flexibility, then let's talk about what's the fastest and most efficient and most transparent and predictable way to go through the process. And then we knit it together and do a consolidated draft. So I go back, Austin. I want to make one more point on this. I want to point out, guys, we expect to hear and we have heard, wow, I can't tell till I've read the whole thing. You can comment now on Module 1. We'd love it. The sooner we hear, the better we can roll it into our thought process. If you miss it, you're busy earning a living and you get around to reading some of it in Module 2, I want to be clear. When we get to Module 2, you can comment back on Module 1. When we get to Module 3, you can comment back on Modules 2 and 1. It all knits together, and many times, even if you're commenting on Module 2 and say, I think something in parking ought to be changed, we may say, you know what? The more elegant way to do that is to fix something we wrote in Module 1. So it's presented sequentially. You have never forfeited your right to comment on what you read. And when we get to consolidated draft, you'll have another opportunity to comment on everything and how it fits together or fails to do so. And that's all before it starts the adoption process. Then you start talking to planning and zoning. I've said this 3 times. They don't agree with me, but I want to make my case to you that I'm right and they're wrong. We ought to change this before it's adopted by the city. So multiple occasions. I just don't want anybody here to get the idea, you know, I'm really busy and I don't have time to comment on this now. We'd love you to. There's no deadline. Sooner is better. But you'll get tired of opportunities to comment by the time this is over. You haven't lost any. Let's go on, Austin. Just to show you in the structure, we've reorganized the entire LDO into 6 chapters, of which we're only talking 2 today: zone districts and uses. 400 is development standards, 500 is procedures, 1 and 6 are boilerplate around that we build as we go along. All right, let's go to the next one. I think we're ready for you to take it away, Austin, in uses or zone district. Go ahead.
Thanks, Don. All right, so we're going to jump into the meat of this installment. Let's start with the zone districts chapter. So first, there have been a good amount of changes, as Don mentioned, throughout the installment to align with the Plan to Succeed comprehensive plan. That includes the list of zoning districts. Now, there's also a new organization with illustrations and some new purpose statements. I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. And we've also looked at those dimensional and lot standards, and generally we're trying to make them more flexible. We've carried forward what's most permissible in almost every case, and in some cases we've gone even beyond that, making the standard more flexible, or proposing to at least. And then we'll talk about this a bit more, but we are proposing to eliminate or at least minimize the use of special districts and PUD type procedures. So here it is. Here's how it looks. This is an example of the R1 zone district. It starts with a purpose statement that again has been updated. Then you can see a picture of the character of that zone district. On the top right, we start with the dimensional standards. And then those dimensional standards are keyed to the axonometric graphic shown just below it. Again, we think this is a much more user-friendly way to approach showing this information. All right, so let's dive into the zone districts themselves. So there are a lot of changes here. I'm not going to cover all of them, but just to say that the green indicates that it's either a new district or a consolidated district, and red indicates that that district is proposed for removal. So R1 and RSA, we're proposing to combine into just R1. R1X and R2 combined into R2. And CN and R proposed to removed. There's no land zoned in that district. Okay, so here's the lineup of mixed use districts. Again, some similarities here, a consolidation and then one new district, the mixed use center district, which has been proposed to help promote the goals and plan to succeed. All right, and our non-residential districts, similar stuff here. Again, a couple removals, but those plan unit development, though the zone district will be removed, it's a legacy district. Rochester got rid of plan unit development quite a while ago. The procedures will still be retained to amend existing approved PUDs. Okay, so we just covered a good amount of information on the base zoning districts. We want to pause here, and we're going to pause throughout the presentation to just give you guys a chance to ask questions on what I just covered. And if there's no questions now, we can move on to our overlay and special districts. But I just want to pause here and see if there are any questions lingering out there on what we just covered.
And I would add, while we're waiting for people to raise their hands or chat, as a basic member, as a basic rule, when we combine things, we try to go with the more flexible, the more liberal between two competing standards. We'll see how that shakes out in public review, but it is not an attempt to restrict. It says, okay, one of them has a greater lot coverage or has more flexibility in development. That's the one we're going to use, and we'll footnote it and tell you that. So here's a question. I've received this question from our members and a few elected officials as well. How did we land on the minimum lot sizes? It's halfway done. We went through your existing tables, the district tables, and in many cases, we carried those forward. We could have left the tables blank in module 1. We carried them forward. In a few cases, like MXI, that's a translation of the MRD district, but it is something we think will be more flexible and more usable for institutional development. We came up with one that is used in a variety, in some other codes. We've tried to footnote it. In module 2, we will go into these dimensions in more depth, meaning there's more to development than height and setbacks and lot coverage. There are lots of tweaks and exceptions and things that have to be explained in more detail. When we release that in the winter of this year as a draft for you to discuss, or early 2021, we will have revisited those. So we've carried over mostly what you have now. In a few cases, a suggested dimension. All of those things are available for comment in module 2, or comment now and say, I think it's way too small. I know that we have at least one councilman who would like to remove all minimum lot sizes in, if you want to do that in commercial and institutional and mixed use districts, that is fine. We do it in a lot of new codes. If you want to do it in the residential districts, just because it would provoke more affordable housing, you could get more houses on a given amount of land. Just be aware that topic gets raised a lot. It very seldom gets implemented, simply because people are so invested. They're willing to talk about greater flexibility and new housing variety and types of housing in their neighborhood. They are often unwilling to say, let's just have no minimum lot size at all. And I'm not even sure, to be honest, it's good planning. I'm not sure it is good planning. I'm pretty well convinced it's not good planning, but it makes a good sound bite. So reasonable lot sizes, absolutely. Getting rid of them in a bunch of mixed use districts, we are happy to talk about that. Getting rid of them in all the residential districts, we will do what our client asked us to do, but I'm warning you, it sounds better than it plays in the actual tug of war of rewriting development codes. It often results in changes, but not elimination.
So I do have a question. Why wouldn't PUDs be absorbed into a new district?
That's actually what we're proposing to, what you mean, well, what the city would like to do with both special districts, and Austin will cover it in a minute, and PUDs, is to say, how close is this to one of the new districts, and can we rezone it into one of those districts? So writ large, that is the strategy, to say, is it already built? Do we know? When they negotiated it, it was supposed to be flexible, but it's already built now. And those buildings are going to stay up for 20, 30 years. We now know what it looks like, and it's a lot like this district, given the flexibility we've built into the code. I don't know if that answers your question, but that is the strategy. But it's not a new district called PUD, because that's just an envelope around a bunch of one-offs, and the city is hoping to get away. And by the way, many cities around the country that have existing PUDs are desperately trying to find a way out of administering numerous one-offs.
Great.
Yep, we should be good with questions right now.
Great. Like I said, we'll be pausing throughout. For those.
Get enough.
Sorry?
Never mind.
Okay, all right. So we'll pause here again in just a second, but let's get through overlays and special districts before we do. So a couple of different things happening in the overlay district lineup. We're bringing in several ordinances that relate to zoning but are not a part of the LDM right now. That includes the airport, Decorah Edge, and heritage preservation ordinances. Those are all coming in. And then additionally, we're proposing to remove some of those parking overlays. Those will be included in Installment 2 as development regulations. And then, as we noted, and we'll talk about right now, we're proposing to remove the special district. And then we'll talk about this a bit later in the presentation, but part of that removal of the special district process will be absorbed by the new local character overlay. We'll get to that towards the end of the presentation. But first, let's talk about our suggestions for special districts. So the graphic on the right summarizes what we're proposing. There's your current list of special districts. As Don said, we would love to be able to rezone these into a base district with the most similar use, scale, and character. That's kind of step one. Step two would be looking at the key development parameters that need to be carried forward as either a site-specific plan or, as I said earlier, the new local character overlay. So that's the general plan, is try to absorb these special districts into one of the new districts we're proposing, or one of the current districts Rochester has. Okay, so I do want to pause here again for questions, because I know a lot kind of is going on with this special districts and overlays. So if we want to talk about those, we can do that now. I think I'll leave this slide up, but if there's any questions on those two issues.
I think the only thing I would add to what Austin says, since you don't see a question right now, is, this is something that's going to take time. Staff in Rochester, not some guys sitting in Denver, staff in Rochester are going to have to look at that list and look at a longer list of PUDs and do the thinking to say, is this close? Is it not close? What was intended to be carried forward? What was key? Obviously, if you try to rezone away from a special district and the old property owner really feels they're being treated unfairly, they're going to say so, and that's going to become a topic of conversation. And so the intent is not to do that. The intent is to try to follow this process through. And then, but there is no formula. As Austin said, as we get into it, it may turn out that there are 3 different ways that you could honor the agreements that were made and are still valued and are not yet built, but the person who negotiated this really needs to preserve the ability to build it. And that is going to be a case-by-case analysis with, I would say, the fundamental bottom line being, does the person involved think it's fair? And that's true of the entire LDO when you write a new ordinance. But the flow chart is just a general approach. How do you typically analyze those types of parking standards? Is a question came in, how do you typically analyze? And I think perhaps since module, we haven't done parking standards too. In module 2, we will be looking at parking standards, but your question really is, okay, so what if a special district has a special parking standards, higher or lower than what would otherwise be? And when we convert it, we say, well, it's pretty close to this district, but the parking standards are not the same. One of the questions is, was that important? Does it remain important? If it is still important to be different, we may need to carry it forward as part of a site-specific approval. Then, notwithstanding the fact that they're in the X district, they have a site-specific approval allowing Y parking standards. That may be true. In general, I'm going to back up a half a step and say, it depends on how important those differences were. In general, parking is treated as kind of a secondary issue. We would like to preserve intensities, land uses, and then not have each approval, one-off approval, have a separate set of parking standards. So we'd like to move towards using the cities. If the question is broader, how do you do it? We generally compare your parking standards to those of other medium-sized and big cities around the Midwest. Those are, working on a transit system, but still pretty car-oriented, and use the lowest one that we think works in a city. There is no comparable city to Rochester, but we keep copies of every parking standard we've ever written. And that's the comparison we will make when we get to that point.
Great. Okay, let's move on to the allowed uses. Again, I'm going to pause throughout here to give you guys plenty of time for questions. All right, so the allowed uses. There's a lot of big changes going on in the uses chapter. One of the most major changes is the introduction of a use table. The use table is going to consolidate information right now found throughout the code. It's going to also propose a lot of simplifications and a lot of different approaches, including a different approach to approvals. I'm going to get into a lot of those specifics, but I will say, just to begin, we've used a color-coded system similar to the one I discussed earlier in the districts chapter. If it's color-coded green, it means it's proposed to be more lenient than it currently is in the code. If it's red, and that's going to be really rare that you guys see red, it's proposed to be more restrictive. Okay, so we've got a new and simplified use list. So it's not just the organization and the display of the uses, but it's the uses themselves. This is a grab bag. This definitely isn't totally inclusive of all of the use changes, but just to show you, these are some new uses. Urban ag is new, artisan manufacturing, and then there's some separations of current uses. So we're introducing a tiered system for retail. And then we're also breaking apart, or we did break apart, area accessory development, which right now acts as a pretty large catch-all for a whole list of uses. We've separated all of those out. Okay, so here it is. Here's the use table. So we like using use tables to display this information because it gives the applicant or the user of the code a simple way to answer the question, what is allowed on my property and with what level of permission? And are there any sort of standards I need to follow in addition? So you can see it's organized by district. We've included the current zoning district lineup so that you can see the matchup. That's just something for user friendliness as we draft, but that will be removed when the code's ready for adoption. And so as we look down at the actual uses, this is the household living category. You can see a whole bunch of green there. That green indicates that use permission is proposed to be more lenient, more flexible than it currently is in the code. Then you can also see that there's a green use in there, that live, work, dwelling. That means that that's a new use. The current code doesn't have that. And then on the far right column, you'll see the use specific standards. So if a use has an asterisk by it, that means a use specific standard applies. And in the actual code document, you'll be able to just click on that use specific standard column and it will take you to that area of the code that shows those standards, what standards might apply to that use. Okay, so just got through some of the big changes with the uses. Any questions here? Anything specifically you want to bring up? Any new uses you think we definitely need to address?
Did you see the questions in the chat?
I see one that says just answer that last one at the end, but I'm not sure what the last one is. Do I have to scroll up to find it? Okay.
Oh, here it is. It's so a
Yeah.
member question.
Yep.
Special districts involve extensive negotiation with the neighbors in the city. If the goal is to find the best zone possible, are we as the owners of the property within the special district going to be part of the discussion when it comes to any potential rezoning and the effect that will have on our ability to continue to build in that area consistent with the previous development?
I like the question, and I love long questions that have short answers. The answer is yes. My assumption is that, and again, you're a little ahead of us. We're rolling this out sequentially. Is that, as I said, staff is going to have to stare at these things and say, is it baked? Is it half baked? Did it not even begin to bake? Is it inactive? Is it very active? What were the key issues? And probably say, either we need to talk to the property owner about this. We could envision rezoning this to the following and carrying over the following parts of their negotiated agreement to exactly what the question says, to allow you to complete your half-built or your partially built development the way you intended, and to honor your commitments to people in phases 1 and 2, that phase 3 and 4 will be what you told them it would be. But I have never been involved in a process where the attempt to simplify and shorten the list of special districts or eliminate them or PUDs did not involve discussions with the property owners along the way. And frankly, we have to, because in some cases, Ryan may call up and say, Don, we've talked to some property owners, and even though you thought they were wonky parking standards, a lot of them care about that. Let's roll that into our parking module. Let's roll that into the citywide discussion. Enough people are saying they want to carry forward. I'm using this as an example. Enough of our special district or PUD people say they care about that. We call it secondary. They think it's important. Let's roll it into the major drafting so that maybe it can inform what standards we're applying to the city as a whole. Maybe it becomes a citywide standard.
Okay, then we got another question. Until the time of adoption, should the proposed districts be the standard used to review projects that come up between now and the time of adoption?
Yes, until a code is adopted, it's not adopted. I think I understand the question. You are operating under the LDM until the day that we have done our work and you have done your work and City Council's done its work and they decide that this is the set of rules and the map we want to move for in the future. We sometimes get a follow-up question. Won't everybody rush to develop under the old ordinance? And the longer we delay, the more you're kind of spending money needlessly, Mr. Consultant. We actually find the opposite, to be honest. If we have done our job, we have people, particularly builders, coming forward towards the end of the process saying, can't you speed this up? I like the new system better than the old system. I would rather be converted and move forward under the new system. I get the logic. I get the flexibility. So yes, but that's part of democracy and governance. This is just a proposal until it starts through the process, and it's not the law until council approves it. And until that time, they will continue. Correct me if I'm wrong, Cindy or Ryan, but every city I've worked for is that we will continue to honor the law on the books and process you as if that's the law that applies to your property.
Yeah, and I know that question specifically extends out from a provision of our existing land development manual that states that different changes in policies and items will be essentially applied or adhered to even prior to final adoption. I don't remember what it is specifically, Ryan. It's like 63.125 or 64.125.
Yeah, it's once something's been initiated. This has not technically ever been initiated, so that would not come into play. This will not be the rules until it's adopted.
I have another question here, and then we'll move on. It says incentive and restricted development were often used as a workaround for restrictions on use variances, and staff and our consultants looked at the last run of those developments and sought to create uses that would allow those types of developments to come in under standard zoning? Yes, that's the short answer to that. Another short answer to a long question. Yes, we have had one eye on what zone districts would implement Plan to Succeed, a second eye on where we, well, very early in the process, Ryan told us, he said, you know, a lot of these restrictive developments are just mixed use. That's what they need, is a mix of uses we don't allow. So one eye on what are you now using restricted and incentive development for that you don't need to, and one eye on just what do we see other cities around the country doing. So yes.
Great.
But I urge you, please, before we move on, please read the use table. I want you to read the whole thing and memorize it, but read the use table and the use specific standards. You guys can understand this. This is the foundation on which we're building this house. And the earlier you can say, you know, I don't think it makes sense to not allow X in the Y district, or why in the world would you allow that in a district? This table will change multiple times as we go through the process. The sooner we get your feedback, the more we can say, you know what, the guy's got a point. So please do orient yourself, as Ryan said, until you kind of get yourself a little in the structure and how it works and what it really says and where information like that is found. You have a hard time. It just seems new and weird and totally different, and maybe I'll just put off reading it till later. I urge you to look at the uses chapter. It's very important. So thanks.
Great. Okay, so let's move on to use approvals. This is a little flash forward of what installment 3 will hold, but we needed to get to this topic to be able to complete the uses chapter. And so what we've done here is we're proposing a major simplification and a pretty big streamlined approach to the way that Rochester currently does approvals. So instead of having a type 1, 2, and 3 process with different phases in that type 3 process, that's going to be converted into either staff, planning commission, or city council approval. You saw how that played out in the use table just a couple slides ago. And generally, as you saw, all that green in the use table means that we have less restrictions on more uses, meaning that fewer uses are going to need to go to city council to get approval, at least as proposed. Additionally, we've proposed 2 new procedures. One is the vacant use process, which is carrying forward a similar purpose of the adaptive reuse process, but in a much simpler way. And another is the interim use process. We'll talk about those a bit more later. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little example of what we've done with the use specific standards. And again, a lot of streamlining here, a lot of simplification. So right now, Rochester has 12 different site location standards. We've broken 9 of those out into 3 distinct categories and consolidated them into those 3 categories. Those categories are location, access, and spacing. And then we have 2 site location standards that were only applied to 2 specific uses. So we carried those forward as use specific standards. We had 1 standard regarding the conversion of a single family dwelling into a duplex. We have proposed to not carry that one forward. So I want to walk through a quick example of how this kind of plays out in practice, kind of tying a little bow on everything we've talked about thus far. So here's a screenshot of the use table, and we're going to focus on the retail use. So we're going to approach the retail use, or we're proposing to, in 4 different categories, 4 thresholds. Breaking the retail use out in these 4 thresholds allows us to tailor the use permissions based off the perceived impact. So you can see retail neighborhood, it's going to be allowed in the most amount of districts with the least amount of approvals required, whereas retail large is going to require the most approvals, and it's allowed in the least amount of districts. And here is the use specific standard for retail neighborhood. So you can see just how it looks and how much it's been simplified. And again, trying to use tables as much as possible to make this as user-friendly as possible. But I show you that example just to show you what we've done here is not just change the standards to be more lenient and to adapt with modern practices and to keep up to date with the type of development that Rochester wants to see, but it's also the presentation of the material that's changed. We believe it's a much more logical organization that will really help with user friendliness. Okay, with that behind us, I want to pause one more time Any questions on what I've just covered? Okay, if not, let's move on to a more specific discussion on changes made from the last draft. So the last time we talked to you guys. And again, I want to emphasize this draft is public. You guys can go out there and get your hands on it. I'm going to turn it over to Don, and he's going to walk us through a couple of these changes.
So we wanted some of this discussion to respond to, you know, hey, I heard the last briefing, what's different? So that's part of it. And then after this, we actually have tried to respond to questions. We know they're partial. We appreciate the fact that some of you read this carefully and ask questions. I don't worry when people read things. I worry when they don't read them. And so we're going to talk about this changes and then some questions that you've asked. So interim use process. Rochester, after we talk to staff, really needs and uses a process by which you can, through a public hearing, get an approval to do a use for a period of years, even though it's not your final intended use of the property. The most common example is a parking lot. I need to use this for a parking lot for a period of years. Currently, Rochester is using its conditional use process for that. Under Minnesota law, you're really not supposed to do that. It's not condition that the system set up under Minnesota law is not intended to be used for time limited use approvals. So we have, after discussion with staff, created in that use table a new designation and a new process for interim uses, which is, think of a temporary parking lot, not one for a festival for 2 days, but one that might exist for 6 months or a year or longer, but that city council is willing to approve, but not as the eventual use of the property. Airport protection overlay, like Decorah Edge, like floodplain, we are bringing in largely what you have now, but that has provoked discussions with the county and city and state specialists in those areas as to, well, are you updating them? Should we bring forward your updates? In the case of airport, there are some technical changes, which we footnoted, but that is a change from last time around because the airport got back to us with some changes and we've rolled them in. Local character overlay has got a lot of people worried. This is an overlay district that is intended to not replace, but to be a simpler way to help neighborhoods and corridors that want to have different design standards than are applicable in their base zoning district to do that easily. It's kind of a placeholder that would be used for different neighborhoods as they come forward. It is limited to design controls. Gee, Don, aren't you just renaming special districts? No, because special districts also have use controls, not in local character. They often have processes, a design review board or a review board or an advisory board or something different from the citywide process to approve that type of development on that site. Not possible in an LCO. We've clarified what the purpose is, what it can be used for. One of your councilmen asked us yesterday, could you go further with that and address that you don't want to, you know, we don't want it to be used for NIMBYism. This shouldn't be, okay, now you've streamlined our residential districts and I'm going to get my neighbors together and try to figure out how we can exclude things. Yeah, well, that's a great question. And so we said we will continue to refine it, but I do think there's a lot of angst or minor level of angst in Rochester over, wow, we got rid of PUDs, then we got special districts. We have special districts, then we have restricted development. And we keep trying to make the system more predictable and transparent and objective. And yet their consultant comes forward and says, what about this? And the answer, short answer is this is supposed to be a lot more limited in use. The reason we propose it is that somebody's going to walk in the door in the next 5 years and say, I just need something a little different because of the character of my neighborhood. And I want you to create a new base zone district, R1Z. And this will be a way of saying you don't need a new R1Z, you just need an overlay. That's why we're proposing it. Go on, next slide. So use permitted, we have added, we have separated the urban agriculture, what can I grow to promote local food production, into a larger use called urban agriculture and a smaller kind of community garden use. That was after discussion with staff as to, oh, gee, I thought this more like a big thing. Oh, I thought it was more like a small thing. So we have clarified that distinction. Substantial land alteration is now listed as a use in your LDM. In most codes, that's not a use. That's a type of development permit you need to get. I need to grade my property, or I need to remove all the trees on my property. I need to do something about reconfiguring the terrain on my property, but that's not my final use. That's not what I'm doing. That's not mining. It's not forestry. It is something I'm doing to prepare the land for its next iteration. It doesn't appear in the table draft now because it will appear in installment 3 as a process you need to go through if you're applying to do things with your land like this. It's not a land use. It's a thing that you do along the way, like installing infrastructure. Use specific standards for renewable energy, solar, wind, and geothermal. We've gone through again and tried to reduce the barriers to encourage people to do them more. Austin has a background on this from his prior work with NREL, and he's drawn on that to try to remove barriers. And then in that table, the red and green circles, we have had comments come in already. That ought to be green. That shouldn't be green. Why isn't that green? Shouldn't that be red? So I would urge you to go through at this stage. It's a color coding system, but in the footnotes, we have tried to explain things. Just to be very clear, green means you used to have to go to city council, but under our proposal, you could only go to planning commission or staff could approve one. Or green means you used to have to go to a type 2 hearing with somebody and now staff can approve it. So green just means the process from application to who approves it has fewer steps or fewer restrictions in it, fewer times around the horn to have people look at your proposal in order to get a yes. Go on, next one, Austin. So obviously, if I were you, if I were a citizen of Rochester, I'd be torn. It's like, I'm glad we hired people who seem to know what they're doing, but how do we know they're just not writing stuff that is applicable to other people and not to us? And so all we can say is we know, we've been working with you folks for the better part of 3 years now. We know about the very unique economic situation of Rochester. We know a lot about the neighbors because they showed up and made us very aware of themselves in the first phase of this project. We've had discussions with Destination Medical Center and the overlapping plan after plan for the circulators and transit that will handle your immense in and out migration for the Mayo related businesses. So we know, we get it. We also know that you have a very strong tradition of negotiating lots of things and that's resulted in the unpredictable. So it's not the same. It really is not the same. I've never worked in 2 cities that I said, this is just like what I just drafted somewhere else. So, but you do face a lot of the same challenges: affordability, this transportation land use connection, and frankly, transparency and predictability. How can we make it so that people feel this is fair and it's not just a matter of how long you can stay at the table to wear other people down and get an approval at some point? Go ahead and then click it again. So again, we're trying to balance those 2 things. That's a very general answer for you. When you read it and you say, wow, I don't know where they got that, but that's not Rochester, tell us. If it is a change that attempts to improve objectivity, predictability, and reduce negotiation, it was probably deliberate. We've been told to do that. And if you told us to preserve all of that, we would have said, are you sure? That's really out of touch with how most American cities are trying to balance affordability and employment and trust in local government. Are you sure you want us? But to no one's surprise, that's been a drumbeat all the way along. We think this system is long and complicated. Do you agree? Yes, Clarion agrees, and that was deliberate. So we're trying to, when we've proposed something, it's because we think there's a better way to do it, keeping one eye on the fact that Rochester is not Bloomington, Indiana, and it's not, Fort Wayne, Indiana, it's not Omaha, and it's not Denver. So we've tried to balance them, but you will be telling us along the way whether you think we got it right or not. Keep going on. Austin, I think we have about 4 slides. Mine's not advancing yet.
Oh, should say, what problems will this fix? Are you not seeing that?
Oh, I'm sorry. It did advance finally. Okay, so
And Don, let's make sure to go through this slide quickly so we can get to the questions.
Okay, fine. I was going to say reduce the number of public hearings. It'll allow a lot of the mixed use. I agree with you. Simplify the administration, we think, of special districts. Make it clearer to understand the intended differences between zone districts. It is a myth that if you had more zone districts, you get it more right. The lines between them become more blurred. This tries to make those distinctions more careful. And again, ties to P2S. Let's talk to the slides that we tried to answer some of RAB's questions. Let's go to the next one. Well, let's skip this, and they can raise them at the end, I think. So we had a question. In this document, we've said, look, here are the districts, there's a zoning map, and the city administration decides where the lines are. Every city has to say, well, when we're not clear where this zone district line does, who decides? Answer, it's an administrator, it's the community development director, zoning administrator. And the question was from RAB, well, where do the appeals go? And our answer is, well, that's really an installment 3 question. We haven't gotten to the process yet. Usually it goes to a board of zoning appeals. Usually it does not go to an elected body. However, at this point, when we read your code, it's not exactly clear to us exactly where it goes. No one has suggested this as something that needs to be changed. I want to make sure I get through these questions, so I won't dwell on it, but I'll come back to it if you want. I will only put my oar in the water. When it comes to interpreting a zoning map, it is not helpful to get elected officials involved. It is, you want the same answer no matter who asks the question on which day of the week, and the way to get that is to have an administrator do it and appeal to an appeals board that is not elected. Sorry, but that's the truth. Okay, maximum size of non-residential uses. This is in MXN neighborhood, the smallest neighborhood scale district. The question was, you've said there's 5,000 square foot size limit. We have said, if you're in this district, which is really a corner, if you looked at the graphic earlier, there's Lick's Ice Cream. That's a store or 2 or 3 stores on the corner in a residential neighborhood. It was built in 1950 or 1940 or 1930. It's viable and it needs reinvestment, but it is not intended to expand. And the question, and that's why we have this neighborhood scale very small. One way to keep it from expanding is to say, you can't put a big use in here. You need to have a limit on the size of these uses to prevent them from becoming destination uses. That's the rationale. We're happy to talk. We've had places use 7,500 square feet. To be honest, I've had places use 4,000, excuse me. Yeah, I've had places use 4,000 square feet. There's no magic number. The question is, how do you allow for viable investment that people can walk to, that they love to walk to, but you got to sell it eventually and get more reinvestment and not have the guy say, you know what, I'm going to turn the whole thing into a 20,000 square foot store. And all of a sudden people say, whoa, 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 that's a different kind of economic activity than what it was built to be and what we wanted it to be. And there are going to be cars coming in here, a lot of cars coming in here for that. So that's why it's there. Next one, institutional. The question was the same thing. Where's the mix, the lowest? I can tell somebody's concerned about our 6,000 square foot minimum lot size. All I can say is we were trying to say you're missing a mixed use institutional district. The closest you have is MRD. Why don't we try to convert MRD over? MRD, it's one of the loose connections, but if MRD had a future life, our proposal is it's MXI. And then we tried to fill out the table. I have a feeling people feel like that 6,000 is too high or too low, probably too low. And we did apply a height limit because MRD has multiple. You know, your current system says, well, it can be this high, and if you go to a higher level approval, it can be that high, and if you go talk to city council, it can be even more. That's not usual. It's not usual to go up the tier. It's to say, in most places, it says, this is the height, and this is how high you can go through incentives, but you don't get to whatever height you need by just going up the political ladder. And we don't advise that you keep that system going. So we chose one, but it can be changed at the consolidated draft. Please read it. Please comment. Please say it's wrong. Downtown, sub-district purpose statements. These are carried over. You have 4 sub-districts. 3 of them are being carried over as part of CDC, now called MXD. The question was, in the business sub-district, it's tied to the downtown Rochester master plan. And the question was, I think that plan's out of date. Isn't it dangerous to tie to a plan? Answer, yes, it's unusual. So it happens when people don't want to have to repeat the key elements of the plan, so they tie it to a plan. But you're exactly right, it gets out of date. We're happy to revisit that if there's a better way of saying it, or if there's an updated plan, or if there's just a way of putting it in English so that the ideas that are still current apply, but the plan itself is not cross-referenced. We would be happy to do that. Next one. TOD, additional standards on building design. There are about 3 or 4 pages in here about designing good TODs. And the questions were, isn't this over managing? We are very well aware that RAB has been very concerned that yes, people care about design. No, we don't want it micromanaging. We need to know they're reasonable and we need to be at the table to discuss it. That's really module 2, but they appear here because these were drafted in 2019 and we carried them forward. So there were a lot of questions, can we change them? And the answer was, We can certainly discuss it if you'd like, but this was done 2 years ago by your elected body. They haven't seemed to want to change it a lot, so we'd rather not spend your money revisiting things that were just drafted 2 years ago. So TOD Village is new. We're trying to modify this to accommodate some of the big circulator stations. And then there was a question, what about this? In the stuff that was already drafted in 2019, it said you got to do one of this long list of 12 things to make your design interesting and people friendly. And then the director can adopt, if you're trying to do articulation or materials change, the director can approve visually significant changes in teller, cluster, wall surfaces if she thinks they achieve the same goal. That was intended to provide flexibility. Well, what if I don't want to do any of the 12? Well, you walk into Cindy and you say, I think I got a 13th that'll work just as well for you. So again, this and many other places in the code, we intend to build in flexibility. I like to have them in one place rather than scattered throughout the code that says, look, we think we know, and your plans say you want X. This will get you X, but let's leave the ability. And frankly, I would rather leave the ability for staff to make a lot of those decisions rather than having to go up the political ladder as part of a restricted development or a tier 3 approval to say, that's close enough. I am the planning director. I say it achieves the purposes as well as one of the 12 items. Last one, I think. Oh, local character. I'm not going to review this. We've already talked about it. Let's go to the last slide.
Great, that's it. So if we have any more questions, be happy to take them.
At what stage of the process will there be an extensive rezoning of the city at large, and what will this process look like? Ryan, we've discussed this internally. Would you like me to answer it, or do you want to answer it?
I can take a stab at it. Thanks, Don. To answer the question, I think at what the process will likely look like is at some point towards the end of the process, we'll put out a map that says, here's what the zoning map looks like today under the current names of the zoning districts, and here's what the zoning map would look like under this new code with the new zoning district names. Now, our intent of that would not be to change anybody's zoning district. And so if you look at the draft UDC, you'll see that B4, for example, is lined up with another zoning district. And that's the zoning district that we think is most comparable to the current B4. And so if you're B4 today, you could look at that draft and see, okay, this is what I would likely be under the new zoning. That being said, there is also an opportunity potentially down the line to say, let's do a large scale rezoning to get our zoning map in line with our land use plan. That's in my opinion, a worthwhile project, but it's a different project than what we're doing here. And so the large scale, I wouldn't call it a large scale rezoning other than a large scale renaming would likely take place towards the end of this project. Does that answer the question, Rick?
I don't want to interrupt Rick's answer, but we recommend that too, because when we bring this forward, and that map usually comes out about the time of the consolidated draft, because now you've seen all the pieces, you've offered comments, and the consolidated draft does its best to reconcile conflicting advice that we've gotten, and now you've got something that is a step closer to a proposal. At that point, now that we've fleshed out not only the uses in B4 or new B4, but also the dimensions and the parking and the landscaping, now you have a better ability to say, okay, I'm looking at the map and I convert to this district. I don't think that's fair. So the only thing I'd add to Ryan is you can tell what the default would be in the remapping, renaming by looking at the use table and looking at the other parts of the draft. In the cities we've worked on for this, we want the debates to be on the code itself, not on the map. And so usually there is an opportunity for property owners to say, yeah, I get it. B4 converts into this new district, but you know what? Look at my property. I don't think that's fair. It's much more like some of the things that you have drafted into another property. So it is not an opportunity for gratuitous upzoning or downzoning, or let's see if I can get my preferred project in under the wire here. But often it is true that staff upon reflection says, you know what, he's right. The fair thing is, and all you do is be honest. it was a straightforward thing. And then we got the following requests to adjust them. We reviewed them. We thought it was fair. We thought it was not giving anybody an unfair advantage. And so we are making, there are some exceptions to the formula remapping. And here's what they are. We're a democracy. This is transparent. And somebody can disagree with us, but our experience has been that's very fair. People understand. It can't be just turn the crank, but you don't want it to be negotiation and arm twisting. And then down the road, you also don't want this map to be controversial, because if the remap becomes controversial, people lose focus on the code itself, and we need the focus to be on the code itself.
All right, I haven't seen any more questions come through, and that gets us right to 4 o'clock, so well done.
Great.
Yeah, so thank you to the city staff, Cindy and Ryan, for the conversations we've had, and Don and his team for taking time out to chat with our members. It's always good to get some input, and this is just one step. I'm sure we'll, as I told Ryan last week, I'm sure we'll get some more questions after this presentation, and we'll make sure we get to those. Thanks for scheduling those cafes, although that name isn't as good as some of the other were suggested. So thanks again, and thanks for everybody for participating. Any other questions, please reach out to us. One other thing, Ryan, is I know we've talked about this before, but it came out of a development executive committee meeting too, is I know we represent a vast majority of the development community and building community in town, but there are some developers that are not members, and I would assume that you're still reaching out to those folks for input as well.
Yeah. So we have, for those on the call who aren't aware, we were at the study session yesterday. We have a webinar this evening that's open to the public. Anybody who's interested can hop on. And we've done our best through social media and different outlets to try to publicize that. We also put together a stakeholder group ourselves, and some may be your members and some likely are not. So hopefully we've hit some there as well. So
Okay.
If we're missing somebody, I hope they reach out, because our intent is not to miss anybody. So
Awesome.
Well, I would just say that the level of involvement of RAB through the 3 years I've been working in Rochester is far above normal in terms of your engagement with these processes along the way. I'm very grateful, and it bodes well for the success of this. So please keep it up. So.
Well, and that goes towards staff. City staff, we've always had a good working relationship. We may not always agree on everything, but we have a wonderful working relationship with city staff, and that has a lot to do with it, Don. So
Good.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right.
All right.
With that, thank you, everyone, and let us know if you have any other questions. With that, we are done. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John. Thanks, Rick.
All
Bye-bye.
right, we'll see you guys. All right, see you in a bit.